The old photograph trembled in her weathered hands. Dr. Phil's face strained of color as he leaned forward in his chair, and for the first time in 20 years of television, the entire studio fell into a silence so deep you could hear the camera operators holding their breath. The grandmother's fingers traced the faded edges of the picture, a young boy, maybe 7 years old, smiling at a birthday party that happened 4 decades ago. "That's the last time I saw my son," she whispered, and in that moment, everything changed. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to the beginning of what should have been just another episode. Margaret Chen was 76 years old when she walked onto the Dr. Phil stage. The producers had titled the segment, "Family Secrets That Destroy Lives," and Margaret had written to the show 6 times over the past year, each letter more desperate than the last. Her handwriting was shaky, her story fragmented, but something in her words had caught the attention of a production assistant who'd lost her own father years earlier. "Please," Margaret had written in her final letter. "I'm running out of time, and I need to know the truth before I die." The studio audience that Tuesday afternoon had no idea what they were about to witness. They'd come expecting the usual Dr. Phil formula, a family in crisis, tough love advice, maybe some tears and a path forward. Margaret sat in the guest chair wearing a simple floral dress and a cardigan that had seen better days. Her hands clutched a worn leather purse, and her eyes, tired, red-rimmed, but somehow still hopeful, kept darting to Dr. Phil as if he held all the answers she'd been searching for. Dr. Phil opened with his characteristic directness. "Margaret, you wrote to us saying you haven't seen your son in 40 years. Tell me what happened." The studio lights seemed to dim as Margaret began to speak, her voice carrying the weight of decades of unspoken pain. "His name was David," she started, her accent thick with the traces of her Taiwanese heritage mixed with 40 years of living in small-town America. "He was 7 years old. It was 1984. My husband, David's father, he was angry all the time. Angry about money, angry about work, angry about everything." She paused, swallowing hard. "One day, he said he was taking David to visit his brother in California. Just for the summer, he said. Help David learn to be tough, he said." Dr. Phil nodded slowly, already sensing where this was headed. The audience was leaning forward collectively. "They never came back," Margaret continued, her voice breaking. "I called the police. They said it wasn't kidnapping because he was the father. They said it was a custody issue. But we weren't divorced. There was no custody agreement. My son just disappeared." A woman in the audience audibly gasped. Dr. Phil raised his hand, signaling for silence. "For 40 years I've searched. I hired private investigators when I could afford it. I joined every missing persons database. I posted on Facebook, on websites, anywhere I could think of. And for 40 years, nothing. No phone calls. No letters. No trace of my son or my husband." Dr. Phil set down his notes, a gesture the audience had seen before when he was about to go off script. "Margaret, what makes you think your son is still alive?" It was then that Margaret opened her purse with trembling hands. The cameras zoomed in as she pulled out a small leather wallet, the kind that had been fashionable decades ago. From one of its plastic sleeves she extracted a photograph, bent at the corners, faded from years of handling, but still clear enough to see the smiling face of a young Asian American boy in front of a birthday cake with 7 candles. "This is the last picture I have of him," she said, holding it up for Dr. Phil to see. "But 3 months ago, I received something in the mail. Subscribe and leave a comment. Because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead." Margaret reached back into her purse and pulled out an envelope, postmarked from Seattle, Washington. Her hands shook so violently that Dr. Phil stood up and moved to sit on the edge of his desk, closer to her. The gesture was subtle but significant. He was abandoning the formal interview setup, moving into her space, becoming not just a host but a presence of support. "Inside was another photograph," Margaret said, opening the envelope with the careful precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times. "No note. No return address. Just this." She handed the second photo to Dr. Phil. The audience couldn't see it yet, but they could see Dr. Phil's face as he looked at it, and what they saw made several people start crying before they even knew why. His jaw tightened. His eyes, usually sharp and analytical, softened with something that looked like both sadness and determination. "Tell me what you see," Dr. Phil said quietly, holding the photo so the cameras could capture it. On the screen, the audience in the studio and at home could now see it clearly. A man in his late 40s, Asian features, standing in front of what looked like a small restaurant or cafe. He was smiling, but it was a careful smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I see my son," Margaret whispered. "He has his father's chin, but my eyes. And this?" She pointed with a shaking finger to a small birthmark visible on the man's neck in the photo. "David had the exact same mark. Right there. I would know it anywhere." Dr. Phil paused mid-sentence. The studio went completely silent. He looked at the photograph again, then at Margaret, then at the audience. When he spoke, his voice had changed. No longer the TV host, but the psychologist, the father, the human being confronting something that transcended television. "Hold on," he said quietly. He turned to someone off camera. "Stop the tape." The command sent a ripple of shock through the studio. In 20 years, Dr. Phil rarely stopped production. The audience members exchanged glances. The camera operators lowered their equipment slightly, confused. Even Margaret looked up, uncertain. Dr. Phil stood and walked to the edge of the stage, where he had a brief, intense conversation with his lead producer that the audience couldn't hear. Those in the front rows would later say they saw him gesture toward the back of the studio, toward what looked like the production offices. He was making a decision that no one had anticipated. When he returned to his seat, his entire demeanor had shifted. "Margaret," he said, "before we go any further, I need you to know something. About an hour before you came out here today, my team received a phone call. We weren't sure if it was legitimate, and we didn't want to get your hopes up if it wasn't. But given what you've just shown me, I think it's time." Margaret's eyes widened. Her breathing became rapid, shallow. "What kind of phone call?" Dr. Phil looked directly into her eyes with the kind of intensity that had defined his career, the moment when entertainment stopped and real life took over. "Someone called our tip line this morning. A man. He said he'd seen the preview for today's episode online. He said he thought the story sounded familiar." The audience erupted in gasps and whispers. Dr. Phil raised his hand for quiet. "He said his name was David Chen. He said he was taken from his mother when he was 7 years old. And he said he's been looking for her for 25 years. Off camera, Dr. Phil made a choice no producer expected. Margaret's hands flew to her mouth. The photograph fluttered to the floor. A member of the audience stood up involuntarily, then sat back down, tears streaming down her face. The emotional energy in the studio had reached a breaking point. "Now, Margaret, I need to be very clear. Dr. Phil continued, his voice steady and professional despite the chaos of emotion around him. "We don't know for certain if this is your son. We've asked him some preliminary questions, and his story aligns with yours in several key details. But we need to be careful. We need to verify. We need to protect you from false hope if this isn't real." Margaret was crying now, silent tears that rolled down her weathered cheeks. "Is he here? Is he in the building?" Dr. Phil nodded slowly. "He's backstage. He flew in from Seattle last night. He's been pacing back there for the last 3 hours, terrified that this might not be real, terrified that it might be." He paused. "Margaret, if you're ready, if you want to meet him, I can bring him out. But I need you to understand, there's a chance this isn't your David. People come forward all the time with mistaken identities or worse. I don't want to put you through that pain if we're not sure." Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, then reached down to pick up the fallen photograph. She looked at it for a long moment, at the 7-year-old boy with the birthday cake and the innocent smile. Then she looked up at Dr. Phil with a strength that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her, somewhere that had sustained her through 40 years of searching. "I'm ready," she said. I've been ready for 40 years. Dr. Phil nodded to someone off camera. The studio lights adjusted slightly, creating a path toward the stage entrance. The audience collectively held its breath. You could hear the hum of the studio equipment, the slight squeak of chairs as people leaned forward, the sound of someone crying softly in the back row. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Margaret gripped the arms of her chair, her knuckles white. Her eyes were fixed on the entrance where guests typically emerged. And then, from behind the curtain, a figure appeared. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with Asian features and hair that was starting to gray at the temples. He wore jeans and a button-down shirt, casual but neat, and he carried himself with the careful posture of someone who had learned to be invisible, to not take up too much space in the world. His eyes scanned the studio, taking in the lights, the cameras, the audience, before finally landing on the elderly woman sitting in the guest chair. For a moment, a long, suspended moment, they just looked at each other. But what happened next is something no one in the room, or watching at home, saw coming. The man's hand went to his neck, touching the same spot where Margaret had pointed out the birthmark in the photograph. His eyes widened, filling with tears. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound came out. Margaret stood up, her legs shaking so badly that a production assistant moved forward instinctively to help, but Dr. Phil waved them back. This moment belonged to them alone. "David?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the studio, everyone heard it. The man took a step forward, then another. "Mom?" His voice cracked on the single syllable, a word he later said he hadn't spoken in 40 years. A word his father had forbidden him from ever saying again after they left. Dr. Phil stood and moved away, giving them space, and in that action, he demonstrated the core of what his show had always been about, not the ratings, not the drama, but the human moments when healing becomes possible. Margaret moved forward, her steps uncertain but determined. David met her halfway. When they came together, when she reached up to touch his face, to verify with her own hands that he was real, that this wasn't another dream, the studio erupted. The audience stood as one, applauding, crying, witnessing something that transcended entertainment. Camera operators wiped their eyes even as they kept filming. Production assistants in the control room later admitted they couldn't see their monitors through their tears. The embrace lasted nearly a minute, both of them crying, both of them holding on as if letting go would make the other disappear again. Dr. Phil stood to the side, his own eyes red, his usual composure fractured by the raw authenticity of what he was witnessing. When they finally separated, just enough to look at each other, but still holding hands as if afraid to fully let go, Dr. Phil approached them carefully. "David," he said gently, "can you tell us what happened? Where have you been?" David wiped his face with his free hand, his other still gripped in his mother's. He looked at Dr. Phil, then at the audience, then back at his mother. "My father took me to California that summer, just like Mom said. But we didn't go to his brother's. We went to Oregon first, then Washington. He changed my name. Changed both our names. He told me." David's voice broke. "He told me that Mom had died. That she'd been in a car accident, and she didn't want me to see her in the hospital. He said she'd asked him to take care of me and move away so I wouldn't be reminded of her." Margaret let out a sound that was part sob, part moan of pain. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no. I never stopped looking. Not for one day." David's face crumpled. "I didn't know. I didn't know until I was 25 and found my original birth certificate in his things after he died. By then, I'd been looking for you for years, but the trail was cold. You'd moved. The phone numbers didn't work. I thought maybe you really had moved on. Maybe you didn't want to be found." Dr. Phil stepped closer, his hand on David's shoulder. "But you kept looking." "I never stopped," David said, looking at his mother. "Just like you never stopped." Dr. Phil turned to address the camera directly, his voice thick with emotion. 40 years of searching. 40 years of never giving up. And today, in this studio, A mother and son are reunited because either of them stopped believing. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. Margaret, David, we're going to help you rebuild what was stolen from you. We have resources, counselors, support systems. This is just the beginning. Margaret pulled her son close again, and this time when they embraced, it wasn't desperate, it was homecoming. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Dr. Phil watched them, and later he would tell his wife that in 30 years of psychology and 20 years of television, he'd never witnessed anything more powerful than a mother's love that refused to die, and a son who never stopped searching for home. The old photograph that had started it all lay on the floor where Margaret had dropped it, a 7-year-old boy smiling at a birthday cake, frozen in time. But standing on the stage, very much alive and very much found, was the man that boy had become. And for the first time in 40 years, Margaret Chen could breathe.